Hi there guys, welcome to our video on language. Okay, and with language we need to understand a couple of things related to them, particularly language families and the origin of languages. So you should kind of be familiar with all those language families, but the one that we need to be the most familiar with is the Indo-European. This is because this is the largest of the language families. And there are so many people that do speak these languages. So in the Indo-European language family, we have it's a pretty large and expansive family tree. So first we have the Germanic. We've got the Balto-Slavic. We have the Celtic. We have the Latin and Romance. And then we have Greek, and then of course we have the Indo-Iranian. Okay, so these languages have historical connections to each other. They all have a similar cultural hearth, and they have words that at some point in history can be traced back to this common ancestor. Now, where did these languages start, right? Well, we know that there are two different theories about where that happened, and I'm just going to draw a terrible map of Europe here, just so that we can kind of get some sort of sense of about where this kind of is. Okay, so there's two theories. One, there is the Kurgan hearth, where there were warriors that kind of moved through Europe, and then also moved into Central Asia and India, and forced people to speak their language. There's also the Anatolian hearth theory, where there were farmers that started here, and then farming technology diffused, and then the language related to agriculture went along with it. Okay, so there are two schools on that. You know, the Kurgan further north, and then the Anatolian in the green. But that's the idea about how that particular language has diffused. Okay, and if we take a look back at then about these language families, you know, these languages and these language families, so the Germanic language, Slavic, Celtic, etc., they all have things that are common in them. And we looked at some examples like words like father, right? So in the Romance languages, they're all very, very similar. So in Portuguese, it's pa, Spanish, padre, French, Pierre, Italian, padre, and Romanian is tata, and they're similar enough in their pronunciation and their phrases that they're similar. But then if we also look at like Germanic versus the Latin and the Romance, there's also similar. So like, you know, German is Vater or Vater, and then, you know, of course in Spanish you'll padre. So they're similar enough in their pronunciation and their language and their meaning that we say that they are related. Okay. So one of the things we also talked about is that even within these languages themselves, we have dialects that emerge. And these dialects form along isoglosses. So if we take, for example, you know, our state that we live in, the great state of Pennsylvania, you know, we have our own isogloss. And we talked about the example of, you know, this is pop over here, and this is soda over here. And somewhere along this border of the Appalachian Mountains, we have an isogloss. We have a language border along these particular words, right? They're both English, but they are different dialects. And this happens from isolation, right? Of course, we know that that's the case between English and American English, so that isolation over years has caused it to develop differently. And we looked at a bunch of different languages, or excuse me, words and examples of this between American English and English, okay? So one of the other concepts that we talked about then are how people of different languages communicate with each other. And we talked about a couple of different things. We talked about, Pigden, or Creole languages. And these are examples of simplified or mixtures of languages from different groups. Creole would be like a combination of Dutch and African languages in South Africa. And the Caribbean languages are some Creole languages that combine those traditional Native American languages with Spanish and French. And a good example of a Pigden language could also be, Spanglish. Right, we talked a bit about Spanglish and along the American border. Okay, we also talked about how people communicate with each other in the terms of lingua franca, and we know that lingua franca is a language adopted by two different language speakers for the purpose generally of conducting business. And we looked at a couple of examples of this. We know that in Africa, for example, Swahili is a lingua franca, but the world's lingua franca is English. So that is the language of business, and people will use English as a lingua franca to communicate if they have different languages. Now, we also arose some questions about the existence of lingua franca in the future. Will it exist? And we brought up example of machine translation, or MT, and this would be your Google Translate. Will it be the death of lingua franca or not? And there are some linguists who think that, in the future we may see a return to more ethnic languages or, localized languages. But for now, English is the world's lingua franca. So we also talked about then, in terms of lingua franca and local languages, we also talked about the preservation of languages. And, as I said before, language is the most important cultural trait, cultural complex within a group. So preserving languages. And so we talked about that with the example of Irish and Catalan, right? That people try to preserve these local languages to preserve their culture. So we looked at some examples of in Ireland where there are road signs that are in both Irish and English, and the idea is to let you know that Irish is the native language there. People want to do that to preserve their cultural history, that cultural connection, and that connection to their past, or their folk culture. Really, is really the biggest example of that. Okay, we talked about toponyms or place names. And how place names and the language that they're in reflect the cultural landscape. So we looked at some examples in the United States and Canada of different place names and the languages that they're in. And we saw, like in the southwest of the United States, there's a lot of Spanish place names like San Diego that reflect the Spanish tradition there. But then as we also go up into Canada, we see the connection to the French language there because of the French connection. So, place names can tell us a lot about the cultural landscape by what language that they're particularly in. Okay, so we want to have an idea of which languages are connected to which cultural realm. So you should have an idea that in the Anglo-American realm, what languages are you going to find, right? Can you tell the languages that are going to be there versus, in the European realm and the Sino-Japanese and those particular things? Well, we have to have an understanding of the story of English. Since it is the world's lingua franca, we need to understand English diffusion, right? And so we have to understand that it emerged. Again, I'm going to draw a terrible map of Europe here. It emerged in the British Isles, right? It's a combination of Norse languages, some Germanic languages, and then also from invasions of the Normans. And we get English emerge here. This is the hearth, right? And then English diffused around the world with colonialism. And that really shouldn't be too hard to understand, since most of the former colonies of England speak English. North America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, South Africa. So those are places where you will find English, and because English has diffused through colonialism, right? So we get a little bit of relocation diffusion, and of course hierarchical diffusion, right, within that. So we need to understand that story and how that happened. All right. So those are some of the key points about language that you want to review. Of course, you can look over some of the study guide questions and go back and look at your key issues. But that's just a quick rundown of some of the things that we learned about when we were studying language. So good luck. If you have any questions, let me know.